Hello and welcome to the Big East. I'm Nedka. My guest today is Alexander Nekrassov, former presidential and government advisor and investigative journalist. Alexander, welcome.
It's a pleasure, Nedka.
Thank you very much for joining me today. Alexander, you have lived through the Soviet Union, through the turbulent 90s and the promising noughties. What are your observations throughout these global political, economic and social changes? Would you say that the Cold War is alive and well, but in a different context?
Well, first of all, the Cold War never really went away, because if it did, then NATO would have been disbanded, just like the Warsaw Pact. So in this sense, no, it didn't go away. But what has changed is that we have now entered the information war. The information war is ruthless, because the West has always been very good at information wars. And basically, in a sense, it won the Cold War because of the information war, the first phase of the Cold War. But now, it is discovering that other countries have realized the value of information and the value of resisting this information war. So now we have this conflict going on around the world, basically, between Western propaganda and the propaganda, if you call it propaganda, but resistance. Well,
it is in a way, because it's propagating for a belief.
Well, yes and no.
So in the original sense.
Yes, I agree with that, but the resistance has arrived. And it has arrived both from Russia and from Asia. Because China is now resisting this attack with its new worldwide television network, very big television network, much bigger than CNN, and it's a quality network. And other countries are following China. And I think this realization changes the whole structure of this information war. The West has now needs to devise, it thinks, new methods of countering that propaganda, as they call it. And this war is heating up really seriously.
That's interesting what you say, because for decades there were two main superpowers at war, if you like, with each other. We had the US and we had the Soviet Union. But now the world is much more multipolar. There aren't just two superpowers out there. There is China, there's India, and there's also Pakistan. These powers are rising, and they're all nuclear armed. So, and they're all trying to exert influence. So they can't very well go to war with each other. So they try to employ soft power tools such as information war, propaganda, in order to exert influence or, to control and to compete with each other or to undermine each other. But let's talk a little bit more about this information war, because what is it all about? And particularly with the rise of social media, this is so important now, and everybody is expressing their opinions, and everybody is disputing with one another, debating on these things. But where is this information war leading us?
Well, first of all, you must understand that the age of Western dominance is coming to an end. That's why we see this information war heating up, because the West does not want to release this leadership. The new powerhouse is Asia. That is it. Whatever the West wants, that is going to happen. That is why the West is basically attacking, on the attack, but in a desperate effort to sort of keep its controlling position, and it's losing ground anyway. Now, what I find dangerous in this information war for the Asian countries is that they're trying to copy the methods of the Western propaganda and Western media, and that is wrong. Because Western media is basically yesterday's product. Western media is based on hostile propaganda, on a lot of deception, and on promoting Western interests with a view of economic dominance. That's a very important part of the propaganda. Now, the Asian sort of powerhouse which we see emerging, they have to understand that they have to resist it with new ways. They have to impose the new information agenda. And for that, they should stop copying all these BBCs, CNN, and all that other press, the Western media. They have to devise their own ways. Russian media is trying to find new ways, but it has succumbed initially in the 90s to this Western model, and it's now trying to change, and I'm actually trying to implement that.
That's right, because you have a regular slot in one of Russia's most, well, probably Russia's most popular TV show with Vladimir Solovyev, and your slot has the highest viewer rating on it. What is it that you say that attracts people so much?
Well, first of all, Vladimir is a great presenter, I must say. He's a very talented presenter. Secondly, we never have a script, ever. So that means we develop the theme during our conversation, although I speak more than he does, but that's another point. And another thing which is very important is that you have to know what you're talking about. Now, unfortunately, a lot of guests on many shows and on television and not radio, whatever, they talk about things, but they're academics. They've never been there. They've never seen action, if you know what I mean. So that is what I think appeals to the audience that watches my segment of that show, which is quite a long show, by the way, 2.5 hours.
You've done a lot of things. I mean, other than being an advisor to the Kremlin and other foreign governments, you've also been a troubleshooter for multinational corporations, as well as an investigative journalist and so on. So, and a political editor. So you're well equipped to talk about
well, that's what I mean. You see, academics, they don't really know the real life. They read, you know, volumes and other works and so on, but they've never been out there. That is why I think the new information has to be based on people who know what they're talking about and who can present it in a way that is interesting to audiences. And of course, when they do their presentations, reports, or whatever, let's say any news agency, press agency in Asia, or newspaper, or television channel, they must understand something. They first of all have to appeal to their audience and not to copy this Western model, which they do. They still do this.
But you know, BBC and CNN, they are still widely watched. I mean, people still believe what the BBC and CNN say. You know, people don't realize, they really have bought into this sensationalized manner of mainstream media. I mean, look at Trump and the whole story, these accusations for 3 years now by the mainstream media accusing Trump of being a Russian agent. And suddenly, a member of the deep state confirms that Trump, in fact, is not an agent, as Trump said all along, that he was not a Russian agent. And yet, you know, where does this leave the mainstream media that have embarrassed themselves? And where does this leave people who follow it religiously?
Well, first of all, people need to learn their lessons from what is going on. They need to understand that what happened with Trump, that was a conspiracy against the sitting president. And the media was basically a propagandist tool. And they must understand something, that when they watch BBC, when they watch any American television network, or any Western network generally from Europe, there's a lot of propaganda in it. Because that's how they're based, that's how they were developed. Let's not forget, for example, the BBC is a state-owned and state-funded broadcaster, right? So you always have to see where this part of information they report and where's the propaganda. By the way, this applies not only to information, this applies even to American films. American films are all of them, practically all of them, are 50% or more US government propaganda. Even those superhero films, they're all based on government propaganda. Now, people don't understand that. They sort of swallow it.
Yes.
That is what I was explaining to my viewers in Russia, that it is important to sort of separate the entertainment part and the ideology and propaganda part. And that is exactly the same applies to media.
But it becomes so difficult.
Well, you
when
have
it's
to
well
learn.
done.
In layman's sort of language, it's called learning to read between lines. Every intelligent person needs to be able to do this. If you don't, you will be like the British population. They believe every word the BBC says. And that is dangerous, because this is the way the propaganda works in the West. These governments, they control their people to an extent that I honestly think that if I compare it to the Soviet times, I think the British people, or the Western people generally, are less informed than the Soviet people, and are more prone to believe government propaganda.
Why do you think that is?
Because they've been brought up as conformists. They find it's easier to live when you believe everything you are told by your rulers, by the political elites. It's easier because you have no problems. Oh, that is like it is. You know, we have a serious economic crisis in the West, basically a financial meltdown in some countries. And nobody seems to notice it because the media doesn't report. That's why, again, another point, when the Asian countries, they watch Western television or whatever and read Western press, they need to understand that this is a war against them, trying to convince them that the West is the model to follow, that they are the leaders of the world, when in fact it is China and other huge, big players in Asia that are proving that no, liberal economics are dead. The new type of economics is emerging in the East. This is the future. So they should realize that they are the Western media is trying to convince them about a myth which does not exist. They should resist it. They should look into their own economies. They should really, really look for new ways to develop them. For example, I can give you an example. The markets now control the Western economies. The markets are devastating for the Western economies. All the Asian countries want to sort of copy these markets. They are creating a similar situation when speculators control the economy. This should not be allowed. This is completely the wrong way to go, because these markets are destroying the Western economy. So I urge Asian economists, and even politicians, and even ordinary people, because they, in the end, will be electing those people who will be politicians and so on, to understand something. The era of the West is over. It will take some time. The agony may last 50 years, but it's over. So it's now, the tide is turning towards Asia, and they're going to be the superpowers of this century or next century and so on. And they need to understand they have to work out their own way and forget this copying of Western models and Western culture as well. Because I noticed some Asian young people, they think, oh, we're going to do exactly the same, the music and the films and so on. No.
Yes.
It's a dead end.
It's true, but perhaps the reason they want to copy the Western model of propaganda is because it has been so successful. When you mention Hollywood, it is extraordinary how Hollywood has been so successful in brainwashing people. I mean, it has really penetrated into the individual and collective psyche, not just in the West, but all across the world. But yes, going back to the Western perception of Asia and Asian leaders and so on, look at Imran Khan. He was the darling of the West. I mean, he was this rock and roll, cool guy who was interesting. He was a superstar, and he was very much admired and loved in the West. Suddenly, all you hear about him is criticism after criticism after criticism in Western media. Why? Well, because he doesn't suck up to the West. He minds his own business. He's a patriotic Pakistani. He's formulated his own model of governance, which has been successful in the most ungovernable parts of of Pakistan. So he's got his own vision, his own unique pro-Asian, not anti-Western, just pro-Asian vision of what his country should look like and will look like in a few years from now. So, and all we read about Asia in the Western media is bad stuff, is negative stuff that paints Asia in a negative, in a backward light, which is completely wrong, as well as insulting, obviously, because that's not the reality at all. I mean, we hear about China, the alleged oppression of Muslims in China, which again is a lie. We hear about all sorts of other terrorism in Pakistan that's not being tackled by the government, which again is a lie. But we don't hear about the achievements. We don't hear about the gains that Asian powers are making. We don't hear about Belt and Road Initiative that is lifting millions out of poverty. You know, so this is very, very important. And we just hear about the Chinese bubble that's about to burst, which is just not the case. How long can Western media go on lying like this for?
Well, first of all, there are many things.
And why are they doing it?
There are very many sides to this. This is a serious issue. First of all, the West doesn't like Asia because it doesn't understand Asia, just like Russia.
And it wants to subdue it too.
Secondly,
perhaps.
to write positively about something, you have to know about it. To write negatively is very easy. That's why some of the Western journalists, they basically take the easy route.
It's like being funny whilst being rude, isn't it? It's very easy to be funny.
You have to know your subject to write positively about it. It's a very difficult journalism. I know this because I'm a former journalist myself. And thirdly, the West is in a sense afraid of the East, of Asia, because they can see the emerging competitor. It is there. They see these emerging giants, powerhouses, and they don't know what to do about it because they are losing ground. Their economic model doesn't work. They don't understand how to change it because this model just has its grip over the whole of the West, and they don't know what to do because the real change would have come if they would have broken up this dominance of the markets, financial markets. They are destroying the Western economy. And that is why they see that the Asian countries, they are not really going the same way. That frightens them because that is probably the way out. What I don't want to see is Asian countries, and Russia included, not as an Asian country, but as another country who is a competitor to the West, do not follow the example of the West. That is the main course. Develop your own ways. You know what I like about Asian countries? They stick to their culture. When you say, you know, Hollywood has this influence, yes and no. I see that, for example, people in China, in India, Pakistan, they're proud of their culture. The Western people are not. They've forgotten about their culture. They don't know. They talk about, you know, mixture of cultures, multicultural and so on. But when I ask them, but where's your own culture? Where is it in this?
They don't know what it is.
Is it mixed? Americans have no culture, okay?
No.
So they just developed on the basis of everything. That is what I think for Asia is the way forward. Stick to your culture, develop it. You know, the Indians, for example, they never succumb to Hollywood. They have their own Bollywood. Now, I don't like those films, personally, but it doesn't matter.
But you know, Indians, so.
No, but they develop their own route, and I like that. The Chinese as well, by the way. Some of the youngsters who go to the West, they get this sort of, you know, feeling, it's cool to watch American films and so on. But generally, they're still sticking with their ancient traditions, even their medicine and so on, so on, so on. So I think that's the way out. Do not betray your own culture, your own identity, because the West has no identity. They've become this one single identity of liberty, human rights, and so on. By the way, meaningless terms when you really see how they're implemented. So this is the way out for Asia, in my opinion.
Yes, in the West we have all these fake sectarian identities, you know, with the identity politics, which is a completely fake and you know, completely, it has nothing to do with Western culture, and it's made up, and it just weakens society and weakens the national identity as well as the individual identity.
Well, the West has become weak.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why the information war is so aggressive on the part of the West. Because every weak side is becoming aggressive.
Well, because they're losing their hard power, aren't they? They're losing economic power. China has a lot of economic power, so China hasn't quite utilized the soft power tools that it could utilize because it has economic power. Whereas the West, the more power, economic power it loses, which is, you know, serious hard power, the more extreme the propaganda and sensationalist it will become to compensate.
But the battle now is raging for the young people, because Western propaganda is very keen on appealing to the young Asians, to the young people, and to lure them into this Western sphere of influence. And that's where I think it is important for Asian countries to develop this sort of counter product, I would say, you know, culturally, economically, and so on, and to explain to the young people all the bad sides, would say, of the so-called free market. You see, the Western economy is no longer a free market. That's the point.
No, that's the point.
The free market has vanished in the West maybe 100 years ago. The first to notice it, by the way, was, strangely enough, Charles Dickens in England and Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer. They said, this is the time when the stock market is taking over. And the stock market has nothing to do with the free market. This is the dominance of the middleman, of the speculator. This is not the producer, when the producer should be king. Adam Smith, the great economist, who basically invented the free market, he said the producer must be king, not the middleman. Now, in the West, the middleman is king. And that is why the middleman will destroy that economy. It's already destroyed in a sense. It's weakened. And that is why when Trump says, oh, look, the stock exchange, you know, they're going up. So what? They don't reflect the economy. The company might be falling apart, but its shares might be trading well. There is no connection to the real world. So the Asian countries need to avoid this. They need to avoid creating these monsters, these financial markets, that will devour their economy and make their people suffer, just like many, many millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people in the West are now suffering because of the financial markets, as we saw during the financial crash in 2008.
Yes. The West's interesting because the West has this mentality which is a sort of, it's a zero-sum mentality, okay? So for decades, throughout much of the 20th century, the West was the cradle of economic advancement, of innovation, of social cohesion, cultural development, or so it appeared. And everybody wanted to go to the West, rich, talented, they wanted to go and live and study and so on. Now it's the other way around. But instead of, in the sense that Westerners are flocking to the East for the same reasons, but instead of working with Asia, cooperating with Asia, the West is insistent on competing with Asia, which is only a bad thing. It can only be to the West's detriment, ultimately.
Competing is not a bad word. Dominating is the bad word. And the West wants to dominate. That is the difference. But it always
has as well.
It wants to dominate. It's got nothing to offer, strangely enough, but it wants to dominate. And once you realize that their economy now is no longer a free market, then the Asian way has to be different. They have to invent their own ways. They have to look at other options. And this is where I want to warn them, because I was a special advisor to the Russian finance minister for 3 years, dealing with matters concerning, you know, relations with the West and how we readjust the economy and so on and so on. And I can tell you something, that the most dangerous thing is to fall into the trap of following the so-called prosperity of the West, which is such a sort of attracts so many people in Asia and other parts of the world. This prosperity is false. This is a game. a lot of people in the West are barely surviving, struggling to make ends meet, especially after that 2008 crash. And that is why you have to look through these sort of charade, this myth about this prosperity to understand it's no longer working. It's not working. We have to come up with the new solutions to it. And I think the Asian people, because they look into their history, into their traditions, into their culture, they can derive a lot of things from there. And that will make them strong. The reason why the West is weak, they've turned back, their backs on their culture, on their heritage, on their tradition, on their religion, everything. Now, they're basically fighting a sort of a phony war, not really understanding what the end of that war would be. So I think the future is with Asia. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind.
Yes, have you noticed there is this very sinister campaign against China and against Chinese products, and also a great deal of discrimination against Chinese in Western societies? Only recently, a professor at Duke University in America was exposed for trying to bully Chinese students from speaking Chinese to each other, citing it as sort of national security threat, which is completely ludicrous. I mean, and also with the Chinese company, mobile phone company, Huawei, they're trying to come up with every excuse in the book to ban the products, Huawei products, you know, because they're saying they're used for espionage purposes and so on, complete nonsense. Of course, this is all about economic competition, but this is not sustainable, surely.
Well, first of all, let's look back and see that the West is victim of its own policy. You must understand something. When they started to transfer manufacturing to China and other Asian countries, they should have realized that they are transferring the most powerful base abroad. Britain is no longer producing anything. Some European Western countries don't produce anything, only services. Britain, by the way, is 80% service economy. That is a disaster. That's a banana republic, technically speaking. America, why Trump realized the danger, America moved everything to China. And then they're saying, well, how come you've invented a mobile phone which is better than our iPhone? Excuse me, but you've been, the iPhones have been made in China. So when you make something, you realize you can improve it, you can make your own product much better. And also
this whole idea of intellectual property is so vague.
These bankers that made hundreds of billions by moving to markets where the labor was cheaper at that time, they didn't realize that you can't move your power base, manufacturing base, and then expect your country to continue to be a powerful sort of nation. It's laughable. The only country in Europe is Germany, which is holding to its power base. But what it's done, it's destroyed the manufacturing in all of Europe now. So they have created this problem themselves. Who? The financial markets. The financial markets are the biggest problem of the West. They are destroying them. And that is why I always call on all other countries, be it Latin America, Russia, Asia, even Australia, don't do the same mistake, don't commit the same mistake. Stay away from financial markets. Financial markets must be restrained. They are monsters devouring the economy. That is why the West will lose this power base to the East, because the East, I think the Chinese understand, and some others as well already, the governments, that you can't let the markets just, you know, decide whatever they want. You have to control them, and they are controlling them. The Chinese have been controlling. They made a few mistakes, but I think they're changing. I think this is a good start.
Yes. And of course, initiatives such as the Belt and Road, they are long-term sustainable projects. You know, and the West talks about this mythical Chinese debt trap, which is the total lie, because, you know, no country is obliged, nobody's forcing each country to go into a business deal with China. You know, they're willingly going along and with the Chinese companies. So, and China, what China does is, if a country can't pay back the loans, well, the China just runs the business, the whatever it's building in the country, until the country is able enough, rich enough to pay back what it owes the Chinese corporations or whatever, the companies or whatever they are. So again, we're told all these half-truths, you know, all these downright lies about what's really going on in Asia.
Well, the problem with, you see, the problem with the West, and America especially, is that for many, many centuries, they have been building their success at the expense of other people's woes. And they were saying, like, we are looking after our interests. What's bad about this? This is our national interest. Suddenly, all these former colonies are saying, well, we are now looking after our own interests as well. And suddenly the West is upset with that. That is the change. You see, they haven't changed mentally in the West.
No,
they still think they're dominating. And suddenly they're told, excuse me, but we have interests as well. We have our own national interests as well. And we are pursuing them. And suddenly they don't like this. When they were doing this for centuries themselves. And that is why I think this collusion this collision is happening, because we now have the new players in the world who are saying we want equality. We are not going to be your slaves anymore. And that's what they don't like, because it was easy life for them.
It was, and they were dominating in every respect. Every country they went into, Western powers. Whereas China, okay, so China has the ability and the capacity to enrich itself and enrich other countries, but it doesn't do so in a domineering, in a self-serving manner. Of course, it's self-serving in the sense that it wants to enrich itself, but it's a win-win. They have these win-win collaborative deals with whichever country China goes into business with. So it's very different from this zero sum. We take it all. We overtake and we dominate, wherever we go.
Well,
and we steal all the resources. China doesn't really do that.
We come back to the information war, because now that the West is weaker, it has to rely on the information war to create this image of a very powerful entity, right? And cultural wars are going to be even more fierce, because cultural wars is part of the information war. And this is why, as I was saying already about these Hollywood films, and not only Hollywood, Western films, that it's very important that the people outside the West realize this is propaganda. Television series, all these cartoons or whatever, they are all propaganda, because they have been mastering the skills of this hidden propaganda for many, many decades. They are masters of this art.
So good, yeah.
But you have to see through them, because that's how you fight them. And you have to offer your young people, and people generally, something different, something more interesting than the Hollywood people are offering, or some other television companies and so on. So you have to create your own television, cinema, culture, and so on, so on, so on. And that, I think, that the Asian countries are not investing that much money into this. Not yet.
Yes.
Not yet. I know they don't have that much money as America has at the moment, but they must pay a lot of attention to this, because this is crucial. This is the real war that is going on for the minds of people, because when you win that war, the rest comes in easily. Absolutely. When I was joking, when the liberal left hijacked comedy and satire in the West in the 60s, the rest was easy. I meant this sort of left-wing propaganda. They were taking over all these things. It was easy because comedy and satire appeals to everyone. If you control that, and look at all these comedy series that the American television spreads all over the world. It's like 55, 60 languages translated into. This is propaganda. This is not comedy, just pure comedy. So I'm coming back to the same situation. The Asian countries have to create their own answer to this. And they should not be greedy on the money. This is big investment. This is for the future investment. This is not just for today. And that is very important. And I think also that Asian people should be proud of themselves because they have achieved a lot under duress in very difficult circumstances. So I advise them not to buy this propaganda stuff that, you know, we in the West, we are powerful, we are clever, we are rich, and you look at you. You are still somewhere, you know, behind them. It's not the case.
It's true because, you know, Asian countries were devastated after the war, and actually a vast majority of them were still under colonial rule when they were trying to develop their new post-war identities, post-colonial identities, those who had come out of colonial rule. So, as you say, they have achieved enormous things under duress.
Considering the circumstances in which they were put, I think they did a lot. And not many people know, by the way, that the Second World War devastated China and other Asia. Not many people know that. Everybody talks about Europe, always Europe.
Always Europe.
But nobody talks about, you know, how many people died in China, that Japan actually was the aggressor.
Korea.
By the way, with Japan, it's my opinion, I think Japan is in a very difficult situation because this Japanese model is actually a Western model. And I don't understand why nobody writes about this, but they are in crisis because they are following the Western model.
Well, I believe because it's a Western ally, Japan.
Well, and not only that, because Japan is a mirror image of the West. And that's why they had to have even negative interest rates, which shows to me, because I did economics and finance in university, when a negative interest rate is introduced, that means your economy is in meltdown, not just, and nobody talks about Japan. Have you noticed? Because Japan is modeled on the West. And even when they have this Fukushima problem, which is still a problem, nobody talks about this. They remember Chernobyl, they don't remember Fukushima, which is still leaking radiation now. Why? Because Western technology was used. So they don't talk about this. And this is why I think that the Asian countries should look carefully at Japan's so-called experience and maybe make their conclusions. I personally think that if Koreas become one, the two Koreas, they'll be the new Japan.
Thank you very much for joining me today, Alexander. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. See you again in the next episode of The Big East. Bye-bye for now. Thank you.